So Automotivated is the title of tonight's lecture. And after the lecture, Mariana and Simon will be joined by Mario Carpo, our professor. So we are very happy to have all of you here tonight. And without further ado, I am handing over the screen to Mariana and to Simon.
First, hello, I am Mariana. This is Simon. Thank you so much, Maya, first for inviting us to present today. And thank you, Mario, also for being in conversation with us. We're looking forward to showing our work and then have a chance to chat and engage with Mario and with the audience. The title, as Maya said, is of the presentation is Compound Beings and Other Natures, which is a conceptual project or framework through which we produce a lot of our work and research. Maya did a fantastic job sort of introducing who we are. Maybe to add to the general outline of our practice, I would say that both of us are involved in academia. We both teach, we write, we lead research projects, and we design. And this has been a structure that has been, for years, instrumental in supporting the connection between ideas and research with projects. The work that we do operates across scales and mediums. And there are many ideas that drive the work, but definitely the relationship between technology, culture, and environment, understanding architecture as an instrument of culture is present in all of our projects. We often work collaboratively with artists, with roboticists, with material scientists, with mathematicians, with planners. We often work also with other architects, with clients as well, and with city officials, etc. So again, a broad range of projects and a broad range of vehicles that allows us to work with different degrees of experimentation as it makes it to architecture. The premise for us is that the knowledge that emerges from all of those fields and all of those collaborations and the ideas and techniques that are associated with those fields can be claimed as a site for architectural speculation and can also be found to have traces in the architectural discipline. Maybe to unpack that statement, we will use this structure throughout the presentation. We have a lot of slides. We both talk fast, so stop us if we're going over time, but we're going to use this structure to cluster projects and share some ideas. So first, we'll start with a very short section on what we call tradition. The work that we're involved with ranges from things that everybody recognizes as architecture, like buildings, to things that operate maybe on the boundaries. This is definitely not foreign to an audience like this. We're not the first ones, not the only ones, but we wanted to introduce some projects and some ideas that we're connected to. And maybe the way we say it is like people that we consider our historical friends. We present specifically this segment of history where architecture has foregrounded in more or less degree the issue of technology in its arguments, in its representation, and in its production. And here, for us, what's important is this evolution from a state where we're just imaging technology to an actual application of technology in the production of materials, in the production of spaces, and as it becomes embedded in the projects themselves. So in this slide, we collected Hans Hollein, Corbusier, Cedric Price, and projects that emerge from looking at machines, from new materials, advancements in industry, the space race and NASA, and in testing the novel collaborations, particularly between scientists, architects, and artists.
So as Mariana mentioned, we pivot the discussion or the discourse of architecture to these other frontiers. So these are three images that we quite like. The first is obviously the beautiful work of Donna Haraway, Cyborgs and Simians, the Cyborg Manifesto, to suggest that human, non-human are no longer so necessarily separate and distinct, but we have quite a lot of overlaps. And this is something that you'll see in nearly all aspects of our work, to suggest that we are not a kind of us and them or subject-object problem, but that there is now a great blurring. The second image that you see is by a group that we quite like, Nove 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 Nove. This is a competition entry that they had in Florence, where, like the Haraway image, it is a woman at the seat of a powerful construct, and one is the computer, the other one is a wheelchair, but that was meant to be a kind of a vehicle that projects her into the other worlds, ensconced in their nature, whether it is natural nature or the other natures that we construct that we consider to be synthetic. And then third image is an image from Susana Suarez, an artist who works with non-humans directly. These non-humans are bees. So in the glass vessel, these bees can sense pheromones and also possibly disease. The slide that we have here is the 100-year anniversary of the word robot, a much maligned, perhaps misunderstood word. It began in Harold Chapek's RUR, which was simply a word that was for worker. Robot is worker. And we suggest that that's possibly not necessarily the case now, where robots are simply our peons or our endlessly, what's the word? Servant? Sorry.
My bad.
Oh, no, that's okay. But that they are now co-agents or even possibly colleagues in the management of resources and of planetary occupancy.
And maybe to add something to that, it's the particular distinction between animals and humans, or things that are organic and machines, has existed in our imagination for a very long time. And now I think we have, as machines and the fields of robotics evolve, this distinction becomes a little more blurry, or at least the relationship between all of these, I'm going to call them agents, begins to change due to the capabilities, to the behaviors, so on and so forth. So that story that began with this subject that was, again, a representation of technology, held latent the idea that the environment was not a stable condition, and that both subject and environment are interconnected, dependent, and perhaps even derivative of one another. So, as we said before, in the context of these talks, this talk we present these images as important connections for the development of architectural ideas and tools, and the questions and opportunities that arise from them, and how those questions and their responses are updated as new technologies emerge, which for us basically produces a framework in which this project always needs to be updated. Now, this is the slide we use to segue into our own work. We call this a map of the world. It's a device or a document that we use to situate our projects within, again, these larger traditions in the arts, in the sciences, and also with important global events, political, social, so on and so forth, and of course, architecture. And it's a map that gets revised with new project trajectories. Oops. Sorry, that was very sensitive. We use, and we'll show in the lecture today, a broad range of technologies that include AR, VR, mixed reality. Sometimes we import technology from other fields. And basically, we've been operating in the realm of physical computing. And at the core, we focus on the relationship between analog and digital phenomena. And the first cluster of projects, we gather through the idea of the active medium. And the first project we're going to show is the Philadelphia mask.
So this is a project where we are embedding urban design, architecture, cognitive mapping, and interactions. So here you see the map of Philadelphia being skewed and displaced with these smart objects on a table. So these objects, they have what's called a fiducial tracker at the bottom, so the camera can pick up where they are in space. And as you move them along this table, the city conforms to that. And it's an interesting experiment for us because it suggested that the city itself is not a kind of set piece, but as you navigate through it, and certainly depending on who you are, the kind of neighborhoods with which you're most familiar, that distances can become elastic.
The big umbrella idea or the focus of the research was how we understand we cognitively understand our environment as we move around, and how we perceive our location via references, and in this case, architectural references. When we first started going to Philadelphia, we noticed that there was a very unusually large amount of empty lots throughout the city. So in a very opportunistic way, we selected some of these lots, particularly looking for differences in the urban fabric around them. And in those lots, we placed characters, and based on their specific location and that information around context, we basically gave each character a name and a narrative. And we were working under this sort of inherited idea from Haydock about a mask, a theatrical reimagining of the city. Each character had a name. It had a formal logic associated with it, whether it was monolithic or striated or polyhedral, linear, cylindrical, etc. Those related to a form finding process. But it also had a medium of expression or a behavior, like light, sound, or kinetics, which began to engage with all the users on a sort of time-based interaction rather than just the fixed one that we're used to. So I'm going to turn the videos below, but that explains the fiducial marker technology that we were using that Simon explained before. Then I'll just show this zoom in. What we did is we selected one character, and this is the one that we imagine to have kinetic properties. And we always, in our projects, range from building models to prototypes, understanding that prototypes are always operating on one-to-one. This one in particular is part of a larger investigation that looks into the reconfiguration of solid figures through the principle of a hinge dissection. So I think on the next slide, yeah, here you can see how this figure can be sort of compact or again, begin to unfold, take more space, change its configuration from vertical to horizontal, and so on and so forth. We do a lot of hinging projects, so we're gonna sort of jump to the next in terms of technology.
So as we mentioned in the introduction, we regularly collaborate with artists, and this is a project with the Carbon Dance Theater Company to produce a cybernetic performance between humans and machines. Here, the body and body's relationship with space were the central metrics to develop the project. We were involved in the design of the robotic arms, the contents of the screen, the wearable controllers used by the dancers throughout the play, to suggest that if we're going to examine architecture as a theater performance, that the highest expression of this would be in the theatrical arts. The arms delineated space within the space of the stage and are also dancers, non-human dancers that participate in the choreography. So what happens in the physical world of humans is connected to what happens in the physical world of machines, non-human performers, and in the digital world of the computer. So like in the mask character that we had in the previous project in Philadelphia, this is a hinging project, in this case, the articulation of the robotic arms as designed through the implementation of a system used in modular robotics. So when we speak of modular robots, this is the realm of a renowned roboticist that we work with quite a lot. And I have my lab, he's my co-director of the lab, Immersive Kinematics. His name is Mark Yim. And he does things with his robots where you have segmented, unitized robots that can join together to produce different configurations. So on the top right, you see a looping robot that then disassembles to perform another wavegate below an obstacle. And then in the top right, it's a different configuration where it is humanoid bipedal. And as you see, the RA here, Jet is kicking it apart. And then it is able to reconfigure, and it's going to take a super long video, which we're not going to show because if you do jump cuts in science, it suggests that you're cheating.
But again, here is one of the first sort of threads or connections where for us, the project in the performance arts and theater is very useful to test ideas that we might want to investigate at the architecture scale. So, but we're always interested in that. So once we understand how these elements work, we begin to imagine almost as a tectonic project, what could this produce if it were a building? So that same modular robot that Mark designed and that we used in Science Performs was used in a research project to produce Polyhouse, which is a deployable shelter system. And we had a grant to actually produce these models, but COVID delayed everything, but we've been wanting to build a full-scale prototype of this for forever.
For this next section, we will show a series of projects that explore material feedback, material behavior in the context of computational processes and interaction. So this project is called Step 7, or Our Fathers, was a result of a competition in Boston for a smaller than a building, bigger than a bread box exhibition that was at the Boston Society of Architects.
Sorry.
No. This project was conceived as a very basic architectural element, a wall. But this wall is formed and articulated to produce a sequence of 4 conditions: a solid, a wall with a void or a room inside it, an occupiable space, and a cross. The question was how to articulate these variations, how a room can be formulated within a wall and to also have formal continuity. So inside this room, inside the wall, is an interactive chamber, a chamber of sound that receives occupants with messages on the principles of architects.
Sure. Again, this was at the Boston Society of Architects, so we were thinking about the audience and while it was open to the general public. What we did is we took 7 randomized recordings by I would call them the fathers of modernism. The idea is that you would get into the room and somehow you would get sort of taught these architects. And then at the end of the recording, through a proximity sensor, a light will blind you and signal that it was time to leave and you were done. You were done with the experience. And one of the things that interested us is that here, the technology was invisible. Again, this appeared as a solid wood material in terms of its material and tectonic expression, which is not always the case when we do interactive pieces that look very sort of techy. So again, the project in terms of technology was investigating that notion. Would people know this is interactive? Would they know how to behave around it? And in terms of its form and its matter, the project is connected to also a larger investigation into conics as the basis for form making. So we do a lot of these projects. This one that I'm showing is meant to be a prototype at a smaller scale. We're working on this at the scale of objects, like as a series of actual kind of lamps, to understand how different materials basically react very differently when working one-to-one, even if the basic universal mathematical principles are the same. And here you see this scaling up again with another installation. This project is the Minister, and this was a competition for something called the Play Day event in the London D in Boston. And here it's the opposite of the BSA project. The technology is visible and it's very literally screaming at you. Each one of these codes that you see was fitted with either a recording device or a speaker. And Simon and I thought we should show these projects again. There's something, when you see these projects that are all very clean usually, but inside there's kind of this monster of cables and algorithms. So there's something about this tension between something that feels very advanced, but at the same time very precarious that we're interested in. So we just wanted to share something that we don't always show. But the project in itself was secret catcher. People could go and whisper secrets. We borrowed Wong Kar-wai's idea of the secret catcher. And then what we did is use an algorithm to amplify and distort the message. So the secrets will be shared in terms of content, but the source will remain anonymous. Do you know this one?
So the same lesson that we learned in cold bending polyethylene, cold bending wood, we transplanted it to the Seoul Biennale in Korea. So this is an office space, right? So you have raised flooring, typical for offices, and then we have lights for some of the panels, and then we have that conic object. And so in this case, there's a lot of winding, custom wound carbon fiber objects as well for seating, hot desking spaces to work. And there was also atmospheric differences where, this is a video.
Yes.
So we are using capacitive cooling. So as you work, instead of having huge amounts of current to make air conditioning, we have almost like fog that rolls in. So the room, depending on the humidity, and in Korea at this time in August was 90-degree humidity, 90 Fahrenheit, which meant the fog layer was quite thin, but it obscured the floor.
We call this project Strange Weather. And I guess the idea that we were toying with or wanted to investigate was the idea that we can design weather to a certain degree. And obviously this is contained within an interior space. But in this case, fog was very much considered a material in the project, which continues in Cloud Cloak, which is a wearable device system movie, Here it goes.
So for this project, again, working with atmosphere as a material, we created this wearable device, much like these Dutch rough collars that I love in the works of Van Eyck. See that it could obfuscate the wearer. So it could hide and promote differences among gender, race, age, identity, so that the wearer can choose to hide who they are.
Okay, so now we're jumping to another section, and these themes will, in some cases, continue in threads on these new projects. So this section we call the automotive, and we started with this sort of information that in the early 21st century, architecture promised to be fully immersive and interactive. We have sensors and new materials and motors that can remake our environments in an, again, ever-changing emergent ecosystem. And in that way, it gives us like new tools and degrees of control. But I think we've also seen the type of kind of catastrophic environmental impact that having this power has produced. So when we talk about environment, sometimes that's something very much related to the scale of the body, as you just saw in the Cloud Cloak project. And sometimes it's more like a reflection on sort of as a planetary scale, how the impact of this capacity.
So, what Mariana just described, in the early 20th century, it was very much the idea of animate form. And certainly in our graduate school at the AA, we looked a lot at, architecture that was incredible. Graduate school at the AA, we looked a lot at, architecture that was incredibly mobile, right? There was continually interactive environments that could shape, conform, or even conflict with human conditions. When we start looking at this grand scale, it takes so much energy to store even 1 gigabyte of memory. So when you send an email with attachments, oh my God, that was a lost word for me. At a human capacity of 50 watts per hour, to save 1 gigabyte of memory on the internet, it would require us to bicycle for 20 hours. So this reliance on power, on current, it's a finite idea. It cannot, it's untenable for long-term thoughts and use. So we've recently been turning our ideas to things that are more, let's say, non-human centric. How do we design for the future in ways that we expend energy to also gain energy?
So we're going to show a sequence of projects, again, that go from objects and a material investigation, architectural scale, and urban scale. We shaped this sequence also maybe to share a lot of our projects are trying to look at how we can use common materials in uncommon ways. So this project sort of starts with a rock, which is one that, which is found somewhere behind our office. And then we produced a lot of rocks. We tried cast concrete rocks and other material solids. And in this case, we took this one and we layered it in rubber and we fitted the rock with a conductor and we plugged it to our computers. So we like this idea that you can plug a rock to the computer and you begin to discover properties that you didn't know rocks would have. And in this case, we used vibrations that we were using vibrations as input. And we were imagining that this could be the vibrations from a busy road, from loud sounds, speakers, active landscapes, so on and so forth. And what happens is actually quite simple. It's just the vibrations on the screen. You just see one possible translation between the input and output as this interface. And we sort of imagining these rocks as these active elements. We use them again in the context of one of our large experimental projects. This one is called the automotive. We use this for the title of the lecture, where each material unit was tested as a building. But all of them are placed on this sort of large structure or disc, which we imagine can serve as a new ground for the city for future development. We see a lot of issues, maybe now in LA, that now that we're in LA is very prescient, like the radical need for densification, as we see that the migration between rural areas and urban areas continues, and how are we going to house this new density and how are we going to produce an infrastructure to support it? So this sort of second ground might or might not be related to the existing ground of the city. We would like, those are projects that we invent in our sort of research, and there's a lot of creativity that goes into getting funding to develop these projects. So every time we have a chance to use a venue to expand on them, we take it. So what you see on the screen now is a drawing we produced. Well, it's not a drawing, it's an artifact we produced for the Biennale, or maybe 2 Biennales ago. COVID is blurring my
2021.
In the Collective Cities exhibitions, where the automotive project became the hotel. You want to keep going? All right, keep going. And here we were exploring Foucault's idea of worlds within worlds. So the elements of, again, automotive get further developed to produce new material and spatial behavior. So here what you see is one of our tests. This piece had an AR component that basically tried to expand on architectural conventions. There's so much that a drawing can express, particularly where you're looking at time-based phenomena or behaviors. So each one of these corners of the drawing held another world within it that will include non-human inhabitants, sometimes the flow of materials like things like water or some type of sort of engineering to support the larger city. We had some sort of recreation of screens and displays. So again, the idea was the expected and what's visible to you and all the hidden layers that actually exist in cities, but in the and how they register in the context of a drawing.
In interest of time, because I think we might be getting close to it, I'm going to speed up my talking. This is a robot. So a robot that is going to become ubiquitous. We are going to have household robots. It's just the way the market, the way that our society is going. So this is a robot that we designed with MAXII again. So this was funded by the NSF. We presented it at the Philadelphia Museum of Art with the show Designing Futures. And it was a really great experience because the way that we have robots is going to necessitate a means and a new culture of how we behave and what kind of socio-cultural implications that robots have, how robots see us, And this is a work that we did again in theater. This was an Opera Philadelphia project called Orpheus and Eurydice. This is a soft robot that is envisioning the serpent that bites and kills Eurydice, sending her to the underworld. This was the result of many trials and errors to make sure that soft robots actually work the way we would like them to, and also, more importantly, to be expressive and evocative on stage, because the technicalities of how things work are not necessarily meaningful for us as human recipients, especially in theater.
We were quite enamored with the effects of this piece. It's very soft, supple moving, almost kind of lifelike element. And again, trying to imagine how this might turn into an architecture. We took the snake with its form, its materials and its behaviors, and then we imagined it as a unit that would be deployed at a larger scale as a skin for the soft house. I think this animation is not working, that's fine. And so we have a project that I think has been ongoing for about 3 or 4 years, which we call augmented tectonics. And we're looking at materials and assembly types that, again, might help us reimagine envelopes of buildings, or basically how we put things together in architecture. Maybe, shall we skip this one to get to house vision?
Sure.
Sorry, we're gonna move a little bit faster. So we'll glance through some projects. In this case, we moved from wood and polypropylene to do a project on carbon fiber, also working with the idea of agents. This was another urban reconfigurable project, in this case, operating on L'Enfant's plan for DC, particularly focused on the structures of power and how we could use architecture to disrupt the way that somehow public space is organized to support those structures of power. So a similar interface to the Philadelphia mask. And this was just one of the drawings that we sort of produced. I'm gonna quickly glance over this while I keep.
A project we just finished for One Object at a Time. We did a whole world synthetic nature project that is exhibited. It just came down from the A+D Museum. This is a short video. Again, this is the teaser for One Object at a Time. And this is kind of landscape that the curator, Ibrahim, had made. And that is our project. It's we are speeding up quicker and quicker.
Do you want me to?
No, it's fine. Let's move on.
All right, let's just pass through this. Apologies, we did not time ourselves before, but this is some of the new experiments we're doing with
how our robots see us as humans, and how it can create new humans if we are able to also be authors of robots.
And maybe just to finish with this project, also something that has been on the deck for a while. This started with an invitation to this project called House Vision. There was, I think, an iteration in Beijing and one in Tokyo. Again, a collective show where they invite many architects to think about the future of domesticity. And this is a project we did also with in collaboration or with the support of the Build Space, the Autodesk Build Space in the Innovation District in Boston. So it also connects with the automotive. This is like, in terms of scale, much, much smaller. This is a house in a sense. Again, a house that comes with certain behaviors that are very different when you have one person versus a small group. I think you explained that more beautifully than I do, if you want to.
Okay, so since it's based in Asia, if you're more Western, you maximize among your colleagues, this house won't rock because everyone is dispersed uniformly throughout. And more, I want to say Asian, I don't want to overgeneralize, obviously, but in other cultures, the idea of personal space is different. So if you have a cluster of people that are walking closer together, this edifice would move because of its geometry at its base.
This was meant to be like one of those fast projects that need to go, like basically a design build project. So we immediately looked at two of the things that we were developing some type of expertise on. So this project was meant to be a combination of CLT panels as part of the sort of wood series of projects we did for a couple of years, embedded with carbon fiber to become also interactive, because we use carbon fiber usually because it's a great conductive material. So here you see some of the details we were developing for construction. This is right before COVID hit, so we don't know when this is going to happen. And we're very interested in the question of accessibility, who has access to technology, who has access to spaces, the type of sort of distorted notion of geography as we can create these types of elements. So here you see some of our experiments in VR for this project, and we're using this in two ways. One, to really think about this as a design tool, basically, how we think about the pieces that make the project, and how we can use the AR medium, the VR medium, sorry, to both visualize, separate parts and sort of work on them. But there's a dimension that is more related to giving access to people. So we turn this into a space that whether you are in Seoul or not in Seoul, you can still come visit, and what would that experience be like? So yeah, we have a few of these things there. You see, we used our work as a background for the exhibition space. Sorry, I'll glance over these. Obviously, the type of immersion that this technology gives you is something that we're interested in general, and the effects of the space. And this is the very last two slides. Parallel to that, we were invited to be part of an exhibition called Drawing Codes that started at the Cooper Union in New York, and then I think is still traveling throughout the country. It was, I think, last month at the CCA in San Francisco. And basically, this is a drawing of that project that, again, seeks to figure out how to maybe corrupt architectural conventions of drawing to include information related to sort of time and change and this type of interfaces like VR and AR, and how this data would be deployed in the context of a drawing. Well, yes, we worked. Do you want to talk about that and Luki?
So the breaking the drawing convention, just being ink on Mylar, this would be also that we worked with a company that makes holograms or holographic images. So what you have is the drawing of the half-pipe house, yes, but behind that is the supernatural realm of in Japan it's called yoke, in Korea it's called space of the hete and the kirin. So you can actually see other worlds if you peer behind it.
So again, the layering of information, the world within worlds, and this sort of strong juxtaposition with things that are material, tactile, finite, and known, with things that are more sort of these projects of the sort of the mythical space and maybe imagination. And all right, well, we made it to the end. I want to stop sharing the screen. I hope we didn't go too long.
No, just perfect. Perfect. Thank you, both of you, for sharing your fascinating work, and really, I think, a great contribution to what this lecture series is trying to do, to kind of look a little bit behind the scenes, right? And expose, you know, kind of like research objectives and methods that architects and different kind of designers use in order to create like this really also beautiful work, body of work that the two of you are creating. So maybe
Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, welcome. First of all, I would like to encourage the audience to, you know, get your questions ready. There's been so much interesting stuff that we saw. So at any point, just, you know, whether type into the chat, or, and I'm happy to read the questions. You can just turn the cameras on and get into the conversation. But for the start, I would like to invite Mario and see what this amazing visual thing that we just saw right now did with his brain.
Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, because I disconnected the helmet, so there was a few minutes. Okay. No, thank you very much for this, for showing this beautiful work. And as mentioned, when we met, but the audience was not there. We reconnect after a 10 years intermission, because we probably met around 10 years ago at the Under the Influence Symposium in Cambridge. And then I was again looking at our mutual biographies. We met without meeting at the first Biennale in Seoul. That was Alejandro's Biennale, because you were there. And I was there, but I didn't go there. I didn't travel to Seoul. I just gave a text for the catalog, but we are both in the catalog. And then I of course, I followed over time your contribution into AD. And let me, where I take my notes. You were in AD Collective Intelligence in 2006, which is indeed a seminal AD, because more and more often I am obliged to go back to that AD to find relevant stuff, which at the time didn't know that was relevant, but evidently Christopher Haidt and Chris Perry knew that, because they put together an amazing group of young people like you and others who are now famous, as you are. But in 2005, you were just kids. And so someone in that team had an amazing capacity of being a talent scout, because they put together in that AD many young guys who only a few years later became prominent and did extraordinary work. You were in the Smart Geometry of 2013, and you are in the more recent Autonomous Assembly of 2017. So in fact, you managed to be in 3 of the best AD of the last 20 years, which is a good result. So while we were speaking, and also I reviewed your work last night, and there are a few keywords which seem to me to be relevant to the work you do, and also some of the words you mentioned, and some you did not mention them, but they are inherent in the stuff you're showing. And in no particular order, I have jotted down geometry, modularity, the monolith, which you do not mention, but you make some of them. Sometimes you make monolithic stuff. The body, which is very important in its various avatars, meaning organic or mechanic or robotic, and then the atmospheres or the environment in the sense it is understood today. And then you may add more, but I would start with that. And let's start with the tough cookie, the toughest cookie of all, which is, however, embedded in what you have been doing since the very start, geometry. And there is this commonplace among digital designers, as you and many of my friends and digital critics, that geometry is a shortcut we don't need anymore. I mean, it was an old invention of Western philosophy, starting from Plato. It's a figment of our imagination, from Plato to Neoplatonism, for post-Euclidean geometries. But the long and short is, in the practical trades, in the stuff we do, geometry was for a long time a tool of our trade, because it allows us to simplify stuff. So we can more easily notate it, calculate it, and fabricate it. A shoebox is easier to draw, is easier to calculate, and it's easier to fabricate than a potato, to go back to a famous, parallel of shoebox and the potato, which is the reason why for many centuries potatoes were very seldom built. But then the digital came, and with the digital came free form, and the notion that with digital tools you can scan any tomato or potato or whatever, any accident of nature, you can bring it into any software, and then you can manipulate it algorithmically, parametrically, vectorially. And so the notational bottleneck, which geometry had represented for centuries, has been exploded by digital tools. With digital tools today, geometry doesn't restrict us anymore, because any accident of nature, including a potato, if necessary, can become a tool of design, thanks to free-form manipulation, etc., etc. And then we thought, that we were at long last free from the constraint of geometry, we realized that geometry is not only a figment of our imagination. There's plenty of geometry outside of our mind, meaning crystals are geometric, snowflakes are geometric, a seashell is geometric. There is plenty of organic geometry out there, which is as mathematic as that which would have been imagined by Euclid. And so as soon as we thought that thanks to digital tools, we were immune from geometry, we realized that there was another universe of geometry, which was going to invade the field of design, coming from nature and not from ideas, Platonic ideas, etc., etc. This conflict is probably embedded also in your interest in modularity. Modularity as such, or modularity as robotic, or modular robotics, etc., etc. We know what modularity means. It is a staple of the Industrial Revolution. It was experimented in the 19th century. It was theorized in the 20th century, mostly by automobile makers, because someone at General Motors around 1930 or 50s realized that if you can make 50 different, apparently different model of cars using the same components, you save a lot of time, a lot of money, because every component is made in more copies, you mass produce the components, you maximize economies of scale. So you give to the customer, the client, the impression that he's buying stuff which is different, but in fact the components are the same. So you maximize economies of scale by simulating the possibility of variations. So far so good, but again with the digital, then since the 90s, things of Greg and Hani, etc., we have learned that digital mass customization enable us to mass produce variations at no extra cost. So the components can be all different. They will not cost more. And for the last 15 years or so, starting with Gramazzi and Kohler, and then Achim Menges and others, we have learned that using robotics, meaning intelligent robotics, the assembly doesn't have to be putting identical pieces into identical places. Today, robots can make an infinite number of different motions at the same cost per motion. So they can pick and choose different pieces and put them in different places at the same cost. So this, once again, would mean that modularity is conceptually, not practically obsolete. It's a constraint that the digital has made obsolete and necessary. It's gone, it's in the past, except that when we try to make something, geometry and modularity still do their job, as we've been doing it for a very long time. And so even if conceptually we think that it is a leftover from the Western tradition and the Industrial Revolution, practically we still need them 90% of the time. But this is the thing. In your work, you inherit geometry, you inherit modularity, you upgrade modularity to put it into robotics and robotic modularity, etc., etc. But then in many of your design work, particularly I have to say in design work, but you have not shown this morning or this evening, but which I reviewed last night on your website. Now, modularity comes with a certain aesthetic, with a certain disposition, a certain feeling, which from Gottfried Semper to Kenneth Frampton, we now call tectonic. And you do use that term, so you are aware of where this comes from. It's the idea that there is an aesthetic which is based on the repetition of identical parts. So all the game is in the joints, the junction, the joinery, because this is where the difficult combination of parts, this is the crucial element. The components are all the same, but the joints must allow the composition in different configurations. But it's still an aesthetic which is based on repetition of identical parts. In much of the stuff you do as designers, including two houses I've seen on your website, one which is being built in the south and one which is being built in the north, meaning one is in Buenos Aires and the other is in Canada. But in both cases, there is an aesthetic of the monolithic chunk, if I can say so, of a single block. And mind you, this is not the monolith of the first digital turn. It is not the streamlined, smooth, shiny, spliny monolith of the 90s. This is a new ontology of the monolith. It's a chunky monolith. It is Tectonian. It is dark. It is disquieting. It is sometimes a bit aggressive and often primitive. Now, I perceive in your work a permanent aesthetic dialectic and sometimes even a tension between the aesthetic of the module and the aesthetic of the monolith, which is nice to see because you can see there is a dialogue between these two attitudes, which are at the core to the expression of two different technical logics. But then, as an observer, you're two persons, and you design as one person. So I have to ask, is one of you the monolith person and the other one the modular person? Or have you both been monolithic at some point in time and modularity at a different point in time? Meaning, do you evolve in sync, or is this tension meaning one is a module and one is monolith? How did it work over the last 20 years of your work?
I thought at first it's so fascinating we rarely pause to do that type of reading of, a body of work. And it's so amazing to hear you do that. Maybe two comments, I would say, I don't think one is a chunk and the other one is a module. I think, but I'm going to think about that for sure. So there's something for me quite distinct about the scale of the projects and the kinds of things that as we get more opportunities to build, like you just mentioned, two projects that were our first ground up projects also for the office, in a sense, which is very different than the installation work, which tends to be, and I don't want to put this on a sort of like a superficial idea or a banal like budget, but those are very low budget projects where we actually tend to use off the shelf materials that are very much modular and repetitive versus perhaps in a project like a house where you cross some threshold and you can imagine sort of other sort of material realities. But I think it's true, we love chunks. We love chunks, and we have a lot of discussions about how to make windows, for example. We don't love punch windows, and that tends to produce monoliths, and we're interested in that sort of relationship between surfaces, not necessarily in the same way as in the 90s, we were talking about surfaces and how to produce them computationally.
You froze. You froze on my screen. You're gone.
On mine too.
Sorry, there is still a blackout. We're frozen.
Yeah, just let's see if they can come back. Give them a little bit of time.
I wish I had my phone number.
Yes, you're back.
Am I back?
I typed my phone number in the chat.
All right, thank you. We'll see what happens. Like you might switch again. I don't know where you lost me, but I was saying that yes, we do love chunks, and there is an aesthetic associated with chunks that, from how and where we place windows to sort of other considerations has been very present in our work versus the installation work that is relies on modularity for completely different reasons. But I think Simon would want to say something about chunks, but first I wanted to say maybe one more thing that for us has been very important about the way you're describing that reliance on geometry and modularity it used to produce also a project where there was a type of fidelity. I think fidelity is another important word for us, between the things that we drew and what we built in the world. And I think for us, what has been a very interesting discovery is that a lot of our projects now, our drawings and our digital models and the one-to-one thing are actually not the same. So there's some sort of tension between sort of precision and approximation, I would say, And if the one-to-one used to be the precise thing, and the drawing was trying to do the closest possible version to it, for us now it has been inverted, and or actually not even inverted. It's like both models are a little bit productively imprecise, and they are what they are, and they give us some useful feedback, sometimes material, sometimes formal, sometimes in terms of the sequence of how we're going to build something. So I would say it's almost like all of our drawings are now, and all of the things would be like some type of approximation, which I think again is very, very different to what it used to be at the beginning of when we acquired digital tools. So that's sort of one idea, and the other one is the chunk. And
so there is a time component in this, but by the way, the projects on your website often do not have a date, so I could not put them in a chronological sequence.
We should put dates on them.
Well, only for nerdy historians like me. For normal people, that's irrelevant. But can I assume then that there is a kind of a marginal incremental shift from early work, which was more modular, to recent work, which is more Chtonian, chunkier, so to speak?
I love that I love the word phonic. It's fascinating for its idea of geometry, but also the sensate of being foreboding, or perhaps not easily legible for humans. When I think of geometry, I think of when we think of geometry, it's kind of our earlier era fascination with Edmund Husserl, the origin of geometry. That's both scientific, but also phenomenological, right? So how it pertains to human sensibilities and to human intellect. If I could add one term that we do have a lot of affinity for, it would be non-human agency of that geometry and of that material, so that it has a kind of governance and it has a kind of of its own, so that it is not easily folded into human intellect, but it has feedback of its own. Greg, hi.
Yes, please, Greg, come back.
Hey, Greg.
No, it's just I'm the first person to try to get ahead of being wrong about things I've said in the past, and just wanted to comment on, Mario, the way you're setting up the conversation. Yes. Right. I was a big advocate for this example of the car industry and non-uniform mass production. The only thing is, I was so wrong, and I now know how wrong I was. And I have to say, Mario, you are very wrong. If you look at the car industry right now, the electric car industry is so radically modularizing, simplifying, and reducing SKUs, which every industry is doing. Even the tennis shoe industry is reducing SKUs. So this idea that software's ability to manage complexity and industrial production's ability to manage complexity is actually not the same. And that's something that I've learned in the last few years. And I think it's very dangerous in architecture to equate hardware and software. And I would just say that for Simon and Mariana, their work is very involved in hardware and software and performance, lighting, sound, all kinds of things, which, yes, are highly variable. And if you take this example of the auto industry, which I think is very valuable, and move it from the 1990s to today, what you see is an electric car like Tesla that is built out of a very small number of parts with a very standardized battery modular system with engines which are duplicatable without change. However, every month you get a software update. And this ability to be non-standard with software, but highly modularized with hardware, is where the industrial world is moving right now, whether it's a telephone or an automobile. And building a building it's the problem with parametricism. It's the problem with this whole trajectory, which I feel partially responsible for advocating for, which I was just totally wrong. And I'm the first one to say I was absolutely wrong, and history has proven me to be completely incorrect in equating software and hardware.
No, but you're punishing yourself unnecessarily.
No, but I don't want to overshadow Simon and Mariana's work in terms of performance and software, and let's say the ephemera that's highly connected to hardware, which I think is unique in their work and with their collaborations. And I think whether it's the buildings or a dance set or working with robots, I think this is a spectrum that's working on the difference between hardware and software. I think now we have to be very specific about where we're talking about standardization, protocols, languages, all of these things. There's a big difference between hardware and software.
Yes, but our job is to take into account or try to clarify or to bring to light the technical logic, the spirit of the tools we use. The fact that implementation in certain aspect of industrial manufacturing may never happen is not detrimental to the clarity of the principles. The notion of economies of scale in many cases does not apply to computer-driven manufacturing. The fact that in many cases we may still want to mass produce and standardize for modular purposes, it's a design choice, which is perfectly legitimate. And in my opinion, in many cases, it will always be. Because just as when we moved to the industrial age, we kept making many things by hand because it still made sense and it makes sense to our day. That doesn't mean that one technology is obliterating the preceding one. It means that the two will keep competing probably for centuries. And the break-even point will keep shifting based on the different cost of electricity, labor, and raw materials. But this is implementation. We should separate what is going to be implemented at different stages, and in some cases may never be implemented, from the clarity of the principle of a new technical logic. This is what conceptually we can do.
I agree in terms of, and also I'll echo, I don't think you need to overly punish yourself, Greg. These are incredibly important milestones in the trajectory of architecture, especially in what Mariana had laid out in the beginning, that there is the kind of branch of architecture that was Hans Hollein, Cedric Price, Archigram, that talked about architecture that is a production of new media, and certainly technology is considered new media, and that it has the resultant things that are not just brick set upon brick, right, in stable, static form, right, things that are immovable. So I think that this is the way that we condition our work, and certainly there is an array of it, and that maybe we should start dating our projects, start to advance and learn from.
I don't know, like somehow listening to this conversation, I wanted to resist the idea of a chronology, although I completely understand the notion of the sort of historic understanding of how work evolves. We find ourselves sometimes revisiting ideas and projects that didn't have necessarily a culmination in the thread from the experimental to the actual. Again, we always want to do, in a sense, architecture and figure out how those ideas would transform architecture. And if the big question is how technology is inflecting design in the agency of architecture beyond other sort of design fields like the car industry or, again, the performance art project, somehow for a moment try to say that maybe the chronology doesn't make sense. I don't know, there's a certain primitivism or things that at some point were impossible, because we did, like when we did the Philly mask, for example, I will share that was 2010 probably. We were not at all working with VR technology or things like that, which would completely transform that project. But some of the principles we we're not ready to show this work, but we're doing some projects related to the idea of the commons, sort of new ideas of public space, and the question of the question of accessibility, who has access to technology, and who are we designing for, who's in the public. It completely changes, but the stage is the same, right, in a sense of the project, but both enabled through the availability of that technology and through other pressures that are more contemporary. Somehow I feel the project became relevant again. And other projects in the middle are not, and we didn't show them, and they become, I don't know if outdated is the word or obsolete. They represent a moment in time, but they don't seem to have a productive second life relative to where our concerns are at the moment.
Yes.
So
all the same, if you want to please nerdish people like me in the future, put on your website a date to each design, so we can see that, you know, that was 15 years ago, that was last month, but for people like me, that gives.
No, I love that. Yes, we're definitely in the nerd camp with you, Mario.
But yeah, for the general public, I think that's perfectly irrelevant. It's just if you want to please a handful of nerds that still exist in academia.
Yes.
Let me bring just another term on the table, and then we open the table to the general discussion. The body, which is evidently so important to the work you do. You work with artists, with dancers, with performers, and there is a phenomenological approach, which I have a feeling that Carleton is a hotbed of phenomenology, right? Kim, you studied at Carleton, right? Yeah,
I did.
You cannot come away from Carleton without having a certain amount of phenomenology into your mental framework. I think it's in the spirit of the place. It's the way it looks like.
Perez Gomez is infused in the building.
It's infused. It's infused. And there is also that phenomenology then is married with a cybernetic approach, interactivity, feedback, and that's so far so good. This is what you do. Then you do robotic. And my question is, do we need to carry on this figural aspect of the body from, robotic arms to the full robots? Meaning, does the robot really need to look like a human? Because you made one that looks like a human, and it's funny, and it is interactive, and people interact more easily with someone that looks like a human than we interact with a Roomba or with a washing machine. And yet, in purely technical terms, the most effective revolutionary robot of the 20th century was the washing machine, which does the washing, but doesn't look like a human at all. And if you want to vacuum the floor, you could design a robot that look like a human, which manipulates a vacuum cleaner, which is made for a human. The advantage is that the robot could do many other things like a human does, but the Roomba is now making both of these obsolete because it sweeps the floor and it doesn't look like anything. It doesn't even look like a cat, which would be good if they did, because I mean, my cat would be less frightened by having these things moving. So to what extent do we need to bring anthropomorphism and figurality into robotics? Because many of the robots you do, the modular robots, don't look like an animal at all. They are completely post-human. And some are completely pre-human. So which way do we go?
I totally agree with sorry, I'm just writing to Patrick really quickly. The anthropomorphization that you just mentioned, it is prevalent, and it is a kind of this skeuomorphic remnant that refuses to go away because people ultimately just want to see things as people.
Yeah, that looks like them.
Right, and so, and the modularity is certainly, if Mark were here, he would agree that there's endless recombinatorics where the physiognomy of us is a limited one. Our eyes see at a certain frame rate, whereas our dog or cat can see at different capacities, or they can hear at far greater ranges than what humans do. So we are a species of limited capabilities, yet we continually measure and see the world through only our lens. So I think it's a great question, Mario. Like, when does that start to be subsumed within, like, let's say a new wilderness of what robots are, right? Rather than this curated domestic vision of robots.
Yeah. But maybe I would also add, because I think the connection to the body is important, that at least in our work, sometimes we do machines that are not robots. Sometimes we do, maybe all robots are machines, but not all machines are robots, kind of thing. And that, when the design for Quarry was happening, I remember at the very beginning, the basic principles of robotics to design, how tall the robot is, or how similar to humans or humanoid-like, and which features, you want to keep but not exacerbate such that it doesn't become threatening, and sort of things like that. So that was kind of like the physical geometrical level. And then there's the sort of type of interaction, if a robot moves too fast. And I think, Greg, speaks incredibly interestingly about the Boston Dynamic robots, for example, right? Or his own, right? When they move too fast, and then it becomes really scary, versus these robots, Ori, that doesn't, have legs. So all of those things begin to matter. And this is almost like I don't want to call it like a body revisionist project, but in a sense, that question interests us a lot. So for example, in Science Performs, the robot arms don't look at all like humans, but at some point they are dancers in the choreography. So in a sense, and I don't think this is a non-committal thing, but I think we produce things that either use robotics knowledge or produces robots along the spectrum. We're not committed to robots that look like us. We're not, it's more like each project might be kind of like an opportunity for us to at least ask the question and figure out what are the technologies enabling or producing. But definitely a question that interests us like very, very much. Because we were doing, I think, separately before we met, work with artists when we were not working with robotics yet. A lot of work with dancers and choreographers, understanding sort of time-based, atmosphere-based, phenomenology-based sort of design. And then robotics became actually a lens and a technology that kind of transformed the project, but also sort of continued going back to the chronology. Now I'm going to obsess about the chronology of things.
Okay. Maya, should we ask the audience if they want to ask something? So we have still 10 or 15 minutes for
Yes,
for
let's
public.
do so. Let's do so. I didn't get any questions into the chat, so maybe somebody, if there are any questions, feel free.
We're familiar with that, yes. When we moderate ourselves at school, the shyness.
But maybe I would have one to start with. Maybe that motivates a little bit the rest of the audience with us. Excuse me. And I'm going to shift the conversation and kind of bring it back a little bit to the or more closer to the topic that that these lectures run under, in terms of kind of research. And I wanna your opinion, since you were so generous with us, share a little bit of not only the work, but kind of like the behind the scene practices, let's say, that are happening. I'm interested about, let's say, collaborations and boundaries. You mentioned at the beginning that you collaborate with roboticists, mathematicians, right? And in a certain way, when you talk about your practice, you talk about boundaries, but you also talk about disciplinary core, right? And I'm interested in kind of two aspects of your practice in terms of bringing knowledge from the outside, from experts, right? And on the other side, your academic work, which is kind of, working and expanding the discipline of architecture, let's say from the inside out, right? By opening the heads of young people who hopefully do not have to do the same step as we did, but we can help them to make bigger step and jump forward. So let's say the research relationship in bringing external knowledge into our practice, right? And then the production of a certain kind of knowledge and maybe performing research, not sure there yet, but within our own discipline in the academic environment, if you could maybe address that a little bit.
Well, we're both so invested and involved with academia that obviously the pedagogy as a project, or the pedagogical project has like a lot of capacity to deal with these questions, right? There's and it's interesting because I think we both teach across the spectrum in our programs where sometimes we're very much, in the core trying to teach foundational knowledge, and then in the most advanced research-based either studios or theses where we have a little bit more space to work outside of canon, established knowledge, origin stories, so on and so forth. But for definitely going back maybe to the beginning of the lecture, understanding that many others have sort of had interest in these questions and in these methodologies, for us it's important. I think we all face this, right? Like we're not reinventing the wheel in some senses, but we can still produce new knowledge. And that's one of the interests that we have in the project of technology. Technology will continue advancing. That means that premise is going to be always unfinished, always changing, always new technology will inflect and transform design. So we often don't show student work in our lectures, but if you look at that sort of body of work, it's very varied. We have, it covers like a very broad range of questions and techniques but also goals and aspirations. So maybe what I would say is that we definitely have an interest on how this new knowledge transforms the discipline, and that by default brings a history with it. So yeah, there might be new knowledge that operates completely outside of that. But somehow I think that's how we tend to operate. Yeah.
No, that's great. I think it's just somehow interesting, and I think it is a different kind of work when you work with a kind of like a swarm, of young minds that that kind of sometimes venture in their own directions and go to unexpected places, right? And that's maybe going into this, that sometimes certain agendas they do have or one does expect an outcome, but one is still getting surprised, right? By I wouldn't have thought that, but interesting route to go. And that's something, at least this happy accident, let's say, it's something very rewarding if they happen, within the pedagogical landscape somehow. So I was kind of interested in in this.
We absolutely rely on happy accidents.
Right. But there's something that you're touching on, which I believe is what is the autonomy of architecture? Like where is the disciplinary core of it vis-a-vis the externalities that we can bring in? So, for example, yes, we happily work with experts from other fields. It's so whether we consider that to be a kind of intersectionality or transdisciplinarity, right. For Mariana and I think you might agree or disagree that we have sliding scales where we are just architects and some of Mario pointed out a couple of north-south projects geographically. And then there's things that we allow the full premise of emergent author, an emergent scenario from many authors that we will still claim to be architecture. So the kind of sliding scale where it's not kind of binary architecture, yes or no.
Right.
And
Right.
I did detect when I was reading your website traces of the core of this disciplinarity in some indexical terms, which people may not notice, but for us in academia, a single word opened the door to a universe of folk. When you mentioned the partie or the poche, this is the universe of Beaux-Arts, which has been transmitted to academia through American formalism, Colin Rowe, Peter Eisenman. This is, whether we like it or not, still 90% of the core of our discipline. This is what architecture is still mostly about. Not a state of affair that I universally approve of, but that's the way it is. That's the way it is.
Yeah, I think in a sense, kind of, I don't know if transcending is the right word, but definitely we openly rely on that type of knowledge and even documentation as a means to, as a base or a jumping board. I don't know, we like the effects of kind of transformative processes. And in order to understand the transformative nature of things, you still need a trace or a reference, and it gets lost. Or maybe at some point you don't. At some point that doesn't matter anymore, and maybe just pure method. I think we're definitely past the practices where the process is exclusively the project. We definitely also belong to that generation. You were talking, Mario, before about sort of Chris Height and sort of that moment in time where the process was the project that we sort of kind of grew up with. But I think now we don't situate our project there, but certainly the processes behind the scenes as a means to intellectualize what we do and actually produce stuff. So yeah, more food for thought for us.
Yeah, we managed to discuss for now more than 90 minutes without ever using the term post-digital. So imagine that I never mentioned it.
It's interesting. Like when we use the word digital, we use it more in as using computers or certain digital technologies, and I think the sort of the discursive aspect of the sort of digital and post-digital and everything that came with it. We don't feel the burden of operating under that all the time for all the projects. Like at some point it's extremely technical. At some point it's extremely discursive. At some point, like I think engage with the broad spectrum of what the digital has brought for us in the same way that, our children use technology with such naturality that it's not a foreign thing anymore, right? Like, because, Mario, for us, the digital turn and the second digital turn were sort of so important in trying to reflect on what we do and what traditions we're connected with, or what groups of designers we belong to and things like that. And at some point, they were also liberating sort of those things. It can be this, and then it will change and it will become that, and it will continue evolving. So we're thankful for that.
Who wants to have the last word? Is Greg still somewhere?
Greg had to leave, unfortunately.
So we will not have the last word.
Mario, I think you should have the last word.
Yes, conclude for us.
The last word is that in Vienna is 8:30, so people will want to go and have dinner. And in Manhattan is 2:30, so I want to, eat the bagels, which I bought immediately. They were all soaked in rain. I hope they dried. So, and you may want to have breakfast.
Yeah. The rain in New York can be heavy.
Well, I think that was great. It was a great lecture, and I enjoyed the discussion. Maya, you have the last word.
Yes. So maybe at this point, I want to say thank you for everyone. Thank you, all the three of you, to join us today. It was fantastic. I want to point out quickly that the next lecture is on April 26th with Maria Ailova from Terraform 1, and she would converse with Hani Rashid. So we hope to see, students and faculty and everybody back. Again, thank you so much, and hopefully we see each other live soon again.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you.
Have
See
a
you
great
soon.
evening. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.